It wasn't just your absence that changed the room. It was the way the air felt different without your presence filling it. Like the way a candle leaves behind not just darkness, but the scent of something recently extinguished. There was still warmth in the space, but it was fading. Slowly the silence took on a texture, almost like velvet pulled too tightly around a memory. You could hear the creak of the floorboards more clearly now. The soft hum of the ceiling fan became louder, more aware of itself, as if it too had noticed what was missing. You kept looking at the chair where they used to sit, even when you tried not to. At first your eyes wandered by accident. Then it became something else, a ritual, a habit, a wound you didn't bandage. Because part of you was afraid that if you stopped noticing their absence, it would mean you'd accepted it. And you hadn't. Not really, not entirely. Sometimes you wondered if they were thinking about the room too. If they missed the way it smelled during the late afternoon light, or the way the curtain swayed in the breeze that only came in August, or if they left and never looked back. The room still held your shared laughter like echoes inside glass. But laughter, once it becomes memory, always sounds a little lonelier. You could trace the moments when you both leaned back in that armchair and said things you thought you'd always remember. Funny how the mind keeps the heavy things sharper than the light ones. You couldn't recall what the joke was, but you could remember how their eyes looked right before the punchline. Soft, kind. Almost too kind, like they knew they were already halfway out the door. It's not that they meant to leave a hole. Sometimes people exit softly, with goodbyes dressed as quiet pauses. You only realize it later, when your phone doesn't ring, when the cup across the table stays clean, when the words you'd saved for them go unused. There's a weight in that, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that lingers behind your ribs. The kind you carry when you walk into that room again, hoping it might feel a little less hollow, and it doesn't. You started turning the lights on differently after they left. It wasn't conscious, just slower. You didn't flood the room with brightness anymore. You eased into it, like you were trying not to disturb something invisible. Maybe the memory, maybe the part of you that still hoped they'd come back. That one part of your soul that looked up when the door creaked. Even when you were alone, you weren't sure what made the room feel colder. It wasn't winter. The windows were still closed. The radiator still worked. But silence has a way of lowering the temperature, especially when it's laced with memories. It turns everyday things into reminders. A half-read book, a favorite mug, a sweater draped over the back of a chair. You didn't move them. Maybe you couldn't. Maybe part of you thought that if you did, you'd erase the proof that they were ever there. The strangest thing was how the silence became a soundtrack. It followed you from room to room, settled beside you at dinner, curled up at your feet when you tried to sleep. You started whispering to yourself, not because you needed to say something out loud, but because silence started to feel too loud. You needed to soften it, to fill it with something human, something living, even if it was just your own voice echoing back. And sometimes you'd swear you could still hear their footsteps, not in a haunted way, just a soft memory layered into the wood, like the way some melodies stay in your head long after the song ends. You'd freeze for a moment, listen, pretend the creak was real, then exhale, then feel foolish. But wasn't that what grief often was? A collection of small foolish hopes that you pretend not to believe in, until you catch yourself believing anyway. There were nights you didn't turn the light off at all. You'd just sit there, staring at the far corner of the room, tracing shadows with your eyes. Not crying, not angry, just still, as if stillness could summon them back, as if being motionless made you easier to find. You wondered if they ever sat still, thinking of you, if the silence was loud for them too, if memory ever knocked on their chest the way it did on yours. You kept every message, every photo. You didn't look at them often, but knowing they were there made something inside you unclench, like proof that they were real, that the laughter happened, that the goodbye wasn't imagined. Some days you'd open the folder and close it before the first picture loaded. You weren't ready. You didn't know what ready felt like anymore. Even the sunlight changed in that room. It used to feel warm, but now it fell across the couch in stripes that felt more like barriers than brightness. You didn't sit in it the same way. You didn't stretch out and close your eyes the way you used to when they were there. You felt watched, not by them, but by the version of you that existed when they were part of your everyday. That old self who laughed louder, who spoke more freely, the self you'd slowly stopped being. And still, the room waited. It waited in the way familiar places always do, holding space for what used to be, never complaining, never forgetting, only dimming slightly. You noticed it in the details, the plant that drooped a little, the candle that never got replaced, the dust on the shelf they used to wipe clean without being asked. The silence never shouted. It didn't need to. It whispered with weight. That's the thing about rooms. When someone leaves, they don't just take their voice. They take the version of the space that only existed when they were in it. The room becomes something else. Not empty, just altered. And you learn to live inside that change. Quietly, tenderly, sometimes with grace, sometimes with ache. And even now as you read this, there's a corner of that room that still feels full, not with their presence, but with the memory of it. Like a song that only plays when you're alone. You don't always hear it, but when you do, you close your eyes and let it finish, because part of you still believes that memory has its own kind of music. And silence. Silence is just the space between the notes. There are things you only notice after someone's gone, like how often their name lived in your thoughts, even when you didn't speak it aloud, how the shape of their absence rearranges the way you walk through a room. You began to avoid the left side of the hallway, without realizing it, because that's where their jacket used to hang. You didn't mean to grieve in patterns, but grief always finds its own rhythm, quiet and strange, weaving through the hours you once filled together. You changed the way you closed the door, softer now, as if they were still asleep in the next room, as if slamming it would wake a ghost you weren't ready to face. You brushed your teeth in silence. You boiled water like it was a ritual. The clink of the spoon against the ceramic cup startled you more than it used to. You learned the language of solitude by accident. You didn't choose to speak it, but now it flows through everything. The nights stretched longer than they should. You stopped counting the hours. You stopped pretending to read. The words on the page lost meaning when there was no one to talk about them with. You let books rest on your chest like a weight instead of a window. Music sounded different too. Not worse, not better, just heavier. Certain songs demanded your full attention, and you had none left to give. Others made your chest ache for no clear reason. You stopped pressing play after a while. Sometimes silence felt safer than the risk of feeling too much. You'd catch yourself reaching for your phone. Reflex, muscle memory, a half-formed thought begging for a witness. You'd start typing and stop halfway. Delete, backspace. Sometimes you'd send it to no one, just saved drafts, little pieces of your heart hidden in your pocket. You needed a place to put the weight, even if it was digital, even if it was invisible. Grief has a way of making time slippery. Days collapsed into nights without permission. You'd wake up and not remember what day it was. Or worse, you'd remember, but it wouldn't matter, because they were still gone. And the version of the day you wanted to share with them would never happen. You stopped planning. You stopped imagining certain futures. It felt kinder not to picture things they wouldn't be part of. There were days you were almost okay. You laughed with someone. You drank coffee without thinking. You stepped into the sun and didn't flinch. But even in those moments the silence remained, tucked into the corner of your mind. A presence with no name. A soft tug reminding you of something unfinished, something still unsaid. You tried to talk about it once, with someone who meant well, but their words came out shaped like solutions, and you weren't looking for answers, you were looking for understanding, for someone to sit beside you in the silence, and not try to fill it. You didn't want to be fixed, you wanted to be witnessed, so you stopped trying. You learned how to hold it alone, how to tuck the ache behind your smile, how to nod when someone asked, "You doing okay?" without explaining the way silence lived in your chest, like a second heartbeat. You became fluent in pretending, not because you were hiding, but because it hurt less than trying to be understood by someone who wasn't listening. Sometimes the memory would arrive mid-conversation, a flash of their voice, a hand gesture, a laugh that sounded almost like theirs. You'd lose your train of thought, you'd nod at the wrong moment, you'd forget what you were saying, and hope no one noticed. Most of the time they didn't. Most of the time, the world kept spinning while you stood still. You went back to that cafe once, the one where you sat across from them, and shared silence without discomfort. But this time the silence was different. It didn't wrap around you like a blanket, it pressed down like a storm cloud. Every table reminded you of something, the chipped mug, the flickering light bulb, the song playing too quietly in the background. You left before your drink arrived. You didn't go back again. Sleep changed too, not just in hours but in weight. You laid down but you didn't rest. Your body stopped moving, but your mind kept pacing. You'd turn over 5 times before surrendering. You'd check the time and wonder how it got so late. You'd scroll through old pictures like prayers, not to remember but to feel something, even if it was just proof of what once was. You wondered if they ever looked back, not just in memory but in longing, if they ever sat in a quiet room and thought about the shape of your laugh, the way you used to line up your words like dominoes, careful, thoughtful, always trying not to fall apart. You wondered if they missed your silences too, the soft ones, the safe ones. You started writing things down, not to share, not to publish, just to make the silence visible. Pages filled with unsent letters, thoughts you didn't know how to speak, questions with no answers. You didn't read them back, you just let them live somewhere outside your head, and that felt like a kind of healing, quiet, small, but real. Some days you didn't think about them at all, and when you realized it you felt a flicker of guilt, like forgetting was betrayal. But it wasn't. It was space. It was breath. It was proof that you were still moving, even if you were carrying them with you. Memory doesn't always demand attention. Sometimes it just asks to be honored in small, silent ways. You learned to make peace with echoes, not silence exactly, but the memory of a sound that once felt like home. You stopped trying to fill the quiet. You started listening to it instead, and in those moments something inside you softened, not because the pain was gone, but because you no longer fought it. You let the room be what it was, a container for the past, a space for healing, a mirror for your stillness, and slowly, without noticing, you became a little quieter too, not from loss, but from understanding that sometimes what hurts isn't the silence itself, but the memories it brings forward. And still you stay, in that room, in that quiet, in that version of yourself that is learning to breathe again, one silent moment at a time. Somewhere along the way you stopped expecting the door to open again, not out of resentment, not because the hope was bitter, but because the hope had grown quiet, softer, like an ember that no longer burned to be seen. It still existed, somewhere under the ash, but it didn't scream for oxygen anymore. It just rested, like you started to. You began cleaning the room not to preserve it, but to make it yours again. You folded the blanket they used to steal during cold nights. You lit a new candle, not their favorite scent, but yours. You opened the window a little wider, and let the breeze rearrange what memory had frozen. And for a brief moment you felt something shift inside. Not healing exactly, but something like permission. permission to live in the room without waiting for it to rewind. You found their pen under the couch one afternoon, tucked into the shadows like it had been hiding. You held it in your hand longer than you meant to, not because it meant everything, but because it meant something, a detail, a fingerprint, a proof. You didn't cry, you didn't smile either, you just sat with it, and that felt honest, that felt like enough. The photos on the shelf stayed where they were, but your gaze changed. You no longer looked at them to ache, you looked at them like chapters, stories that belonged to a version of you that had felt deeply, loved wholly, and lost something they didn't know how to name. You didn't rip the photos down, you didn't frame new ones, you just let them be, like ghosts that had learned to whisper instead of haunt. You started talking to yourself more, out loud, not in madness but in kindness. You told yourself things you used to wait for others to say. You did your best. It wasn't your fault. You were enough, even when you weren't chosen. These weren't affirmations. They weren't mantras. They were apologies. From you to you. And maybe they arrived late, but they arrived. There were still nights the silence pulled at your collar like a child wanting attention. You'd lie there, wide-eyed, heart full of unnamed weight, and let the quiet say whatever it needed. Some nights the quiet said, "They're gone." Other nights it said, "You're still here." And in that contrast you found something like acceptance. Not relief, not surrender, just truth. You didn't want to forget. That had never been the goal. You wanted to remember in a way that didn't break you open every time. You wanted to carry the memory like a letter in your coat pocket, creased, folded, still legible, but not something you needed to reread daily. And one day you did just that. You carried it without pulling it out, without tracing every word, without crying at the signature. Sometimes healing isn't loud, sometimes it's not even visible. It's just the moment you sit in a room that used to echo with loss, and you realize you're not afraid of the silence anymore. You still feel it, you still know what it holds, but it doesn't own you. It doesn't steal your breath. It just exists, alongside you, like an old friend who no longer needs to speak to be understood. You started inviting people over again. Not many, not often, but enough. Enough to make the walls learn laughter again. Enough to let the air shift from memory to presence. You didn't fill the space to replace anything. You filled it to remind yourself that life still fits here, that warmth still belongs here, that you can hold new joy without betraying old grief. You wrote one last letter, not to them, to yourself. You didn't start it with "Dear." You didn't sign it with a name. You just wrote what you needed to hear. You survived the silence. And for the first time in a long time, you believed it, not as a sentence but as a sensation, a quiet, steady warmth rising from your chest like breath in a cold room. You don't know if they'll ever come back. And that thought doesn't burn the way it used to. It sits gently beside you, like a forgotten question you no longer need the answer to, because you've changed. The room has changed. The silence too has softened. It no longer waits for them. It simply holds space for you. And maybe that's what healing looks like in the end. Not fixing the silence, not chasing noise, not filling the gaps, but learning to be in the room with all of it, with the memory, with the ache, with the quiet, and still choosing to stay, to breathe, to live, because the room may have gotten quieter after they left, but you got stronger inside it. There were so many moments where words formed in your throat and never made it out. Things you wanted to say but didn't. Not because they didn't matter, but because you thought silence would be safer. You thought holding it in meant holding it together. But the truth is, what you don't say doesn't disappear. It waits. It settles. It echoes inside the hollow spaces you try not to touch. You told yourself it wasn't the right time, that if you just waited, maybe they'd understand without you having to say it. Maybe the look in your eyes, the tension in your jaw, the softness in your tone would fill in the blanks. But people don't always read between the lines you're too afraid to draw. And so they walked away thinking things were fine, while you stood there, full of unfinished sentences. The worst part is how clear those words become after the moment has passed. In the dark, your mind replays the things you should have said. Not dramatic confessions, not declarations, just truths. Simple truths. That hurt me. I needed you to ask. I wasn't okay. But those truths stayed buried, and now they haunt you in the quiet, like echoes bouncing around a room only you can hear. You wonder who you could have become if you had spoken sooner, if you had chosen honesty instead of comfort, openness instead of silence. But then again, silence wasn't comfortable. It just felt familiar. A defense you built so early, you forgot there was another way to exist. You were praised for being calm, for not making things harder, but what they called strength was really fear, dressed up as peace. You kept your feelings tidy, wrapped in politeness, masked in smiles. You apologized too much. You laughed things off. You said it's fine so often that your mouth forgot how to shape anything more honest. And when people praised your composure, you swallowed the scream that wanted to say, I'm not okay, I just don't know how to show it without scaring you. Sometimes you convinced yourself it didn't matter, that the things you held back weren't worth the risk, that you were being dramatic, sensitive, difficult. But deep down, you knew it mattered. You knew because the silence stayed with you longer than the conversation would have. You knew because the weight didn't go away. It just changed shape. And the people you loved, they didn't always notice. How could they? You made it look easy. You became fluent in hiding. You turned vulnerability into a private ritual. One where you'd cry in the shower, or stare too long at the ceiling, or write things you'd never show anyone. You gave everyone the best parts of you, and left yourself to hold the rest. You learned to read people so well, to anticipate their needs, to soften your truth so it wouldn't bruise theirs. You became the safe place, the listener, the fixer. But who became that for you? Who asked what you never said? Who waited long enough to hear the pause behind your I'm okay? Sometimes you wonder if they would have stayed if you had spoken your truth, or if the truth would have scared them away faster. That fear stopped you more times than you can count. The fear of being too much, of being misunderstood, of being rejected, not for who you pretended to be, but for who you really were when the mask slipped. But the thing is, holding back didn't keep the hurt away. It just made it quieter. And quiet pain is still pain, sometimes louder than anything else. It lingers. It resurfaces in strange ways, in overthinking, in sudden tears, in the ache that arrives when you least expect it. The body remembers what the voice couldn't say. You replay conversations where you smiled through discomfort. You remember moments where you wanted to ask, do you still care about me? But instead you said, I'm happy for you. You remember when someone disappointed you, and you said nothing, just nodded, as if your silence was easier for both of you to carry. But it wasn't. Not really. You kept telling yourself next time you'd be honest. Next time you'd speak before the silence became a wall. But next time kept moving further away, and you kept growing quieter, even as the noise inside your chest grew louder. A storm behind a closed door. You didn't mean to become distant. You were just tired. Tired of not being heard. Tired of explaining yourself to people who didn't really want to understand. So you shut down slowly, subtly, in ways no one noticed until you were already gone. And even then they said, I didn't know you felt that way. As if they ever asked. Now you carry those unsaid things like secrets. Not just from others, but from yourself. Because admitting now would mean admitting how long you stayed silent, how long you waited, how long you needed something more. But it's not too late. Even if the moment passed, even if the person is gone, Even if the silence lasted longer than the connection, you can still say it now, not to change the past, but to free yourself from its echo. You deserve to speak. You deserve to be heard, even if the only one listening now is you. There were entire days when you felt the words rising in your throat, like waves preparing to crash, only to swallow them back down before they made a sound. You weren't even sure who you were protecting anymore. Them, yourself. The fragile balance that existed between pretending things were okay and fearing what would happen if you named the truth. So instead you let the silence answer questions that were never asked. And now all you have are questions that never left your chest. You learned how to keep your tone steady, your face calm, your voice quiet, even when everything inside you was trembling. You were always so careful not to burden anyone, so careful not to be the reason someone else felt uncomfortable. You were the peacekeeper, the one who made it easier for others to walk away without guilt. You smiled through goodbyes and laughed at moments that stung. And later you would lie awake wondering if they ever sensed the ache beneath your stillness. Sometimes you imagined the words spilling out. In the middle of a quiet moment, you'd think, what if I just said it now? What if I told them how much I needed them to understand? But the moment always passed. You'd look at their eyes, their hands, the way they fidgeted with the edge of their sleeve, and you'd decide it wasn't the right time. Maybe next time. Maybe when you're braver. But braver never arrived, and neither did the words. It's strange how you can speak to someone every day and still feel like you're holding an entire world of yourself just beneath the surface. You watched them move on, forget, live, love, grow, all while you stood still, clinging to the things you never got to say. You tried to forget, you tried to let it go, but silence doesn't dissolve. It turns to residue. It coats your thoughts. It lives in the pauses between everything else. There were moments when someone new asked how you were, and you almost said it, almost opened the floodgate. But how do you explain a silence that's lasted so long? It became part of your identity. How do you unwrap a feeling that's been pressed flat and folded so many times it barely resembles itself anymore? So you said, I'm good, and they smiled, and you nodded, and once again the echo grew louder. You wonder sometimes what would have changed had you just spoken. If you had said, I'm not over it, or that hurt, or please don't leave like that again, would they have stayed? Would they have softened? Or would they have looked at you like your truth was an inconvenience? That question has no answer, and the not knowing is almost worse than the memory itself. You've written messages in your head so many times you could recite them by heart. Late at night you rehearse what you would say if given the chance. Not with anger, not even with blame, just clarity, just truth. You'd say, I didn't know how to tell you back then, but I needed more, or you mattered more than I let on, and that scared me. But these words live in drafts and dreams, never in conversations. They float in the space between sleep and waking, like whispers from another version of you, the version who never learned how to stay quiet to stay safe. You've seen people talk about closure, about how it brings peace, but you've realized closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it's the act of letting yourself feel what you buried, of sitting with the sadness you ignored, of admitting, not to them but to yourself, that what you didn't say still matters, that the silence wasn't empty, it was full, too full, and now, even in your happiest moments, you can still hear the echo. It's not always loud, sometimes it's just a flicker of memory, a name, a date, a familiar scent, but it reminds you that your silence shaped you, that the things you held in didn't vanish. They wove themselves into your thoughts, your reflexes, your fears, into the way you flinch when someone raises their voice, into the way you downplay your feelings before anyone can judge them. You're learning now, slowly, that you don't have to keep choosing silence, that your truth is not a threat, that speaking doesn't always lead to loss. It can lead to light, but it takes time. It takes unlearning. It takes facing the ghosts you created by never calling them by name. So tonight, maybe for the first time, you let yourself say it out loud, whatever it is, to the empty room, to the mirror, to the stars. You speak the sentence you never finished. You complete the thought that stayed lodged in your chest. You say their name without wincing. You let the words fall where they may, not to be answered, not to be forgiven, just to be released, because maybe that's how you quiet the echo, not by forgetting the silence, but by finally breaking it. There was a night you stood at the edge of saying everything, the kind of night where the world feels still enough to finally speak, the kind of quiet that dares you to be honest. You had the message typed, every word chosen with trembling precision, not angry, not dramatic, just real. You stared at it, heart thudding like a warning, and then, you erased it, backspace after backspace until nothing remained. And even though you never hit send, the message stayed, not on the screen but in your chest, humming like a low chord that never resolved. That's the thing about what you don't say. It doesn't just disappear into thin air. It settles into your habits, into the way you hesitate before asking for help, into the way you assume your needs will be too much, into the way you offer understanding before asking for it in return. The silence you kept starts to live inside your choices, shaping how you show up in every room, every relationship, every moment where truth knocks softly, and you pretend not to hear. You don't blame anyone. Not entirely. The world teaches silence early, especially to those who feel deeply. You're told not to overreact, not to make it a big deal, not to be the one who ruins the mood. So you learn to be soft in your suffering, graceful in your disappointment, quiet in your unraveling. You wore your wounds like well-tailored clothing, never messy, never visible, always just enough to look put together. But inside, the echo grew, louder with every passing year, louder every time someone asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" And you didn't have an answer. Or maybe you did, but it was too layered, too painful, too vulnerable to unwrap in that moment. The truth was always there, but the words never felt safe enough to land. And now the echo shows up in new ways. In the way you flinch when someone doesn't respond. In the way your heart sinks when a message stays unread too long. In the way you prepare yourself for goodbye, even when no one's leaving. You rehearse heartbreak before it happens. You brace for silence like it's inevitable, because somewhere along the way, you learned that people can love you and still not hear you, and that taught you to speak quietly, or not at all. But even now, even after all that, there is still a part of you that wants to be heard. That part has never given up. It's the part that whispers when everything else falls silent. The part that still writes messages in the Notes app, still mouths words to the night sky, still imagines the moment someone turns to you and says, "Say it. Whatever it is. I'm listening." You've carried this silence long enough to know its shape. It's familiar now, a companion more than a stranger. But that doesn't mean it has to stay forever. It doesn't mean the words can't come, slowly, gently, like thawing ice. Maybe you don't need to say everything at once. Maybe just a sentence. Maybe just a sigh. Maybe just the truth that you weren't ready then, but you're closer now. And maybe the first person you need to say it to is you. The version of you who waited, who stayed silent to protect others, who held pain like a secret, because they thought no one would understand. That version deserves your voice, your softness, your apology, not for being quiet, but for believing they had to be. So you begin. In the quiet of your room, you speak the first truth that rises. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It just has to be yours. Maybe you say, "I missed you," or "That wasn't fair," or simply, "I hurt." And maybe no one hears it. Maybe the only witness is the silence itself. But that's enough. Because the moment you speak it, the echo shifts. It doesn't vanish, but it changes. It becomes something else, less like a ghost, more like a shadow, still there, still part of you, but no longer holding all the power. You've reclaimed it, word by word, breath by breath, and one day, maybe sooner than you think, someone will sit across from you and ask about the quiet in your eyes, and you'll take a breath, and you'll speak, not all of it, not everything, but enough, enough to feel seen, enough to be known, enough to finally believe that your voice was never too much. It was just waiting for the right moment to be free. There were moments when silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like punishment, like a slow, invisible way of being told you did something wrong without knowing what it was. You'd sit there, retracing your steps, overanalyzing your words, replaying every conversation for a misstep that might not even exist. Silence turned into a mirror you didn't want to look into, not because it reflected who you were, but because it made you question everything about yourself. You weren't unfamiliar with this feeling. It started early, maybe in childhood, when being ignored meant you had disappointed someone. When a closed door or a cold stare made you feel smaller than your own voice. You learned that silence wasn't just an absence, it was a message, and often the message was that you were the problem, even if no one ever said it out loud. So when someone you cared about went quiet, it didn't feel like a pause, it felt like rejection. Not a loud, sharp rejection you could argue with, but a quiet drifting that left you uncertain and uneasy. You weren't given answers, just space. And in that space, your mind filled in the blanks with self-blame. Maybe you said too much. Maybe you asked for too much. Maybe your presence became a burden they didn't know how to carry anymore. You wanted to ask them. You wanted to say, "Did I do something wrong?" But you didn't want to seem needy, so you waited. You made excuses for their silence. They're just busy, they're probably overwhelmed. It's not about me, but the truth was, it felt like it was about you. Because when someone disappears without explanation, your mind will write its own reasons, and yours has always leaned toward guilt. There were times when the silence came after an argument, or a disagreement, or a truth you finally dared to speak, and instead of dialogue, you got distance. Instead of working through it, they vanished, and that disappearing act said more than words ever could. It said, "Your honesty made me uncomfortable." It said, "You're too much." It said, "I don't want to deal with this." And whether or not those were the intended messages, they became the ones you believed. You didn't want to be the one who begged for attention, who chased after people just to understand why they stopped talking. So you mirrored their silence. You shut down too, but it never felt empowering. It felt like loss. It felt like sitting across from a closed window, trying to convince yourself that the wind would return if you waited long enough. But it didn't. And neither did they. And yet you still blamed yourself, because silence has that power. It's shapeless, but it presses against you like a weight. It gives no answers, so you fill it with your own insecurities, with old wounds, with the ache of not being enough. And soon you can't tell whether you're grieving them or grieving the version of you that thought this time might be different. You started to notice patterns, how certain tones, certain pauses, certain kinds of quiet felt familiar, like emotional déjà vu. You'd sense the distance before it happened. You'd feel the withdrawal in a message that was a little too short, in a call that never came, in the hesitation behind their "I'm fine." And even though no one said anything, your heart braced itself, because you knew what was coming. The slow unraveling hidden inside silence. You tried to be understanding, to give them space, to not take it personally. But silence doesn't teach you patience when it's paired with confusion. It teaches you fear. It makes you question whether love is conditional, whether connection can vanish just because you were honest, whether your presence is tolerable only when it's easy, agreeable, and small. Sometimes the silence was strategic, a way to regain control, a way to make you apologize first, a way to make you question your own reality. And other times it wasn't malicious, it was just avoidance. But avoidance still leaves wounds. It still whispers that your feelings are too loud, your needs too heavy, your love too complex. So you shrink, you become quieter, you choose your words more carefully, you tread lightly, hoping that by being less they'll stay longer. But silence shouldn't be a weapon, and it shouldn't be a punishment. It shouldn't make you afraid to speak, or question your worth, or rewrite yourself just to stay accepted. You're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to need reassurance. You're allowed to feel hurt when someone you love goes quiet and leaves you to figure out the story on your own. You've spent too long thinking that being ignored is something you deserved, that if someone walked away silently, it must be because you pushed them, that your feelings were too inconvenient to hold. But silence isn't always about you. And even when it is, it doesn't mean you're unworthy. Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to stay. Sometimes they go quiet because they don't know how to face the noise inside themselves. And maybe the most painful part is how much you still wanted to believe the best in them. How you kept the door open, the light on, your heart soft, just in case they came back. Just in case the silence ended with something kind. But deep down, you knew. You always knew. The silence didn't mean I'm thinking. It meant this chapter is closing. And I won't say why. So here you are, still holding the weight of what was never said. Still carrying the blame for a silence that was never yours to answer for. But maybe now, you're ready to set it down. Not all at once. Not forever. But just for tonight, just long enough to breathe without apology, just long enough to remember that silence is not a reflection of your worth, but of someone else's inability to hold it. You started confusing peace with silence, as if the absence of conflict meant everything was okay. But deep down, you knew better. You knew that silence can be a wall just as much as it can be a refuge. And in your case, it often felt like a cold hallway, one you kept walking through without knowing when or if a door would open at the end. You wanted so badly for things to stay calm, to not make waves, that you forgot still water can drown you too. You'd sit in those silences and try to decode them. Was their quiet meant to punish? Were they waiting for you to speak first? Had you crossed an invisible line again? One you didn't know was there until it had already been broken. You replayed everything you said, everything you didn't. You apologized for things you didn't even believe were wrong, just to make the silence end, just to hear anything other than your own spiraling thoughts. It wasn't just about them. It became a pattern. Silence triggered something in you, something old, a fear that maybe you were always just one sentence away from being too much. That if you said the wrong thing, they'd go quiet again. That silence wasn't just a moment, it was a warning, a threat dressed up as stillness, a signal that love might be conditional, and you'd better figure out the rules before it's too late. You thought that being quiet made you easier to love, that if you asked for less, expected less, shared less, they'd stay longer. But love that only survives your silence isn't love. It's convenience. And you deserved more than that. You still do. You deserve to be known, not just tolerated, to be heard, not just nodded at, to speak without fearing what silence might follow. You noticed how your body changed in those moments, the way your shoulders tensed, the way your voice got softer, the way your heart beat faster, like it was trying to warn you, this is familiar, this is dangerous. This is the part where you disappear again. You started shrinking before anyone asked you to. You pulled back before they could. You made yourself small so they wouldn't have to push you away. And when the silence finally broke, It wasn't always with kindness. Sometimes it came back sharp, passive, distant, words laced with something that sounded like indifference. They acted like nothing happened, like the silence didn't shake you, like your quiet unraveling was something you should have handled better. And in that moment, you realized they were never going to acknowledge the damage done by their withdrawal, because to them it was just space. But to you it was abandonment. You told yourself to toughen up, that silence was just part of life, that not everything needed to be talked about. But that voice inside you kept whispering that something wasn't right, that maybe you weren't meant to live in emotional shadows, that love shouldn't require so much decoding, that maybe the ones who really see you wouldn't leave you wondering whether you were the reason they went quiet. Still you stayed. You stayed through the silences, hoping they'd end with softness, hoping that after the quiet would come clarity. But more often than not, the silence ended with distance, with a version of them that no longer reached for you. And you blamed yourself for that too. You thought maybe you expected too much. But expecting communication, presence, care, those aren't too much. They are the bare minimum of love that's real. And yet you grieved them as if they had died, even though they were still there, breathing, living, posting, laughing, just not with you, not for you. And that silence was louder than any goodbye ever could be, because it didn't end with words. It ended with erasure, as if your chapters were torn from their book, as if your voice had become something they could mute without consequence. You started speaking less in new relationships, offering less, waiting longer to open up. Silence taught you how to protect yourself, but it also taught you how to hide. And now you keep parts of yourself tucked away, like fragile things you don't trust others to hold. Not because you don't want to be known, but because being ignored once made you believe that being known might not be safe. But something in you is starting to shift. Slowly, quietly, you're beginning to see that silence isn't always your fault, that their retreat says more about their capacity than your worth, that love doesn't vanish just because someone doesn't know how to stay, and more importantly, that your voice deserves more than echoes. You don't need to prove your pain to anyone. You don't need to earn your right to be heard. Your feelings are not an inconvenience. They are not a test someone has to pass. They are simply yours. And that makes them valid, whether they listen or not, whether they stay or not, whether they speak or disappear again. And one day you'll hear a silence that doesn't feel like blame, a silence that feels like peace, a silence shared with someone who doesn't make you question yourself. And in that space, you'll finally remember what it feels like to rest, to breathe, to be loved without fear of vanishing. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from always wondering if you've done something wrong. The way your mind begins to fill every quiet moment with self-doubt. How silence becomes less of a pause and more of a verdict. You stopped feeling peace in stillness a long time ago, because every still moment became a stage for your fears to perform. You didn't hear calm in the silence. You heard judgment, distance, disappointment, and maybe worst of all, indifference. You stopped reaching out first, not out of pride, but out of self-preservation, because you grew tired of being the one who always broke the silence, of being the one who had to pretend everything was okay, just to keep the conversation alive. You wondered what would happen if you stopped speaking. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? So you tested it, and the silence grew, and no one came. And that absence said everything you feared it would. People told you to be strong, to let it go, to not take it personally. But how do you not take silence personally, when it's shaped like your name, when it follows your footsteps, when it comes after you open your heart a little too much? You weren't looking for constant attention. You were looking for connection, for someone to say, "I hear you," not just with words, but with presence, with effort, with care that doesn't vanish. When things get a little difficult, you started editing yourself, cutting your emotions down to bite-sized pieces, offering only what you thought they could handle. You became fluent in the art of half-truths, not because you wanted to lie, but because you were afraid the whole truth would send them running. You didn't want to be the reason they went silent again. So you watered yourself down, hoping that being smaller might mean they'd stay longer. But silence still came, not with explanation, not with grace, just absence. And in its wake, you were left to carry the burden of unanswered questions. You played both roles in the story, the one who asked and the one who answered. You imagined their voice, filled in their reasons, created entire dialogues in your head, just to soothe the ache of not knowing. And in doing so you slowly forgot what it felt like to be genuinely understood. You found yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, just to make things easier, just to make the silence end. You said sorry for being honest, sorry for needing too much, sorry for having emotions that didn't fit neatly into someone else's expectations. And they let you carry the guilt they didn't want to acknowledge. And you did, because somewhere deep down, you believed it might be your fault anyway. But it wasn't. Not all of it. Silence isn't always a response to wrongdoing. Sometimes it's a reflection of someone else's discomfort, avoidance, or inability to engage. And yet you kept taking the blame. You wore it like a second skin, because if it was your fault, then at least you had some control. If it was you, maybe you could fix it. Maybe you could earn their return. But silence doesn't work like that. It doesn't reward effort. It doesn't trade in closure. And so you began to unlearn. Slowly, painfully, you began to sit in the silence without assigning it meaning. You stopped chasing people who didn't want to be found. You stopped decoding every pause like it held the secret to your worth. You stopped apologizing for your voice. And in the stillness, something softer began to grow. Not confidence, not yet, but clarity. The understanding that your need for communication isn't weakness, it's human. You started gravitating toward people who didn't flinch at your honesty, who didn't retreat when you showed emotion, who didn't use silence to punish, but to pause, to reflect, to breathe. You realized the difference, how one silence made you feel unseen, and the other made you feel safe. And slowly your nervous system began to relax in the presence of those who stayed. There's a deep kind of healing that happens when someone says, "I'm not going anywhere," and then proves it with consistency. When someone holds space for your feelings without making you feel like a burden. When their silence is filled with warmth, not withholding. And when that happens, you start to trust again. Not just them, but yourself, your instincts, your worth, your voice. You'll still feel the sting of silence sometimes. That old fear doesn't vanish overnight. It echoes. It taps you on the shoulder when someone takes too long to reply, when the room gets too quiet. But now, you know what to do. You don't rush to fill the gap. You don't make yourself smaller. You sit with it. You listen, and if the silence feels wrong, if it feels like blame, you remind yourself this is not mine to carry. And in that moment, the silence becomes yours again. Not as a punishment, not as a void, but as a space to breathe, to rest, to remember that your voice is still here, whole, unbroken, and finally, free. Your memory isn't loud, it's persistent. It doesn't shout at you. It taps gently, constantly, like soft rain on a window that never stops. It finds you in the quiet moments, when the day slows just enough to let old thoughts return. A specific light falling across the floor, the shape of a stranger's hand, the way someone laughs and suddenly you're not here anymore. You're somewhere you didn't choose to revisit, somewhere you thought you'd left behind. But memory doesn't care about time. It comes when it wants, with no regard for how ready you are. You don't remember everything, just the things that hurt enough to stay, the words they said when they thought you weren't listening, the look in their eyes right before they left, the silence that followed you like a shadow. It's not that you want to hold on to these things, it's that they've held on to you. You've tried to forget, You've begged your mind to let go. But some memories aren't stories. They're scars. And scars don't vanish. They just soften. You remember details that no one else would think to notice. The way their voice cracked when they said your name. The exact song playing when everything changed. The smell of the room. The temperature. The pause between words. You carry these fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror, each one reflecting a version of you that still wonders what went wrong. And the hardest part, most days you look fine. You smile, you function, but beneath it all you're still living beside a door that never fully closed. People say time heals, but they don't tell you what to do with a memory that feels as fresh today as it did years ago. They don't explain how to carry a moment that keeps echoing, even after the person is gone. You've tried rewriting the past in your mind, tried to give it new meaning, a softer ending. But some memories resist being softened. They want to be witnessed. They want to be felt all the way through. It's exhausting, isn't it? The way remembering becomes its own kind of grief. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. A quiet weight you carry from room to room. You catch yourself zoning out, staring at nothing, lips pressed tightly together, as if holding back words that don't have a place anymore. And even when you're surrounded by people, even when you're laughing, a small part of you is still elsewhere, still replaying something you can't change. You envy people who forget easily, who move on without looking back, who can leave a place, a person, a chapter, without dragging the whole story behind them. But that's not how you're built. You were made to feel deeply, to remember gently, to hold space for what once was. And while that makes you compassionate, it also makes you tired, because remembering too much means never fully resting. Sometimes you wonder if memory is trying to teach you something. If maybe these moments return because they're unfinished, because there's something inside you that still wants to be heard, not by them but by you. Maybe your memory isn't the enemy. Maybe it's the part of you that refuses to let pain go unnamed. The part that still wants to understand. You've carried certain conversations for years. Words you wish you had said differently. Things you regret not doing. Goodbyes you never got to give. And even though you know you can't go back, part of you still stands at that doorway, hoping for a chance to say, wait, I wasn't ready yet. But life doesn't wait. And neither did they. And so you hold on. Not because you want to, but because letting go feels like betrayal. As if forgetting means it didn't matter. As if moving forward means you're leaving something behind. But you're not. You're allowed to carry the memory without carrying the pain. You're allowed to remember and still breathe. You remind yourself gently that memory is not proof of weakness. It's proof of love, of care, of depth, of having lived fully, even if it ended in silence. You remember because it meant something, because they meant something, and maybe, just maybe, that's not something you have to apologize for. So tonight when the memory returns, and it will, don't fight it. Let it sit beside you, like an old friend who no longer needs answers. Let it rise and fall like a tide. You no longer resist. Let it speak, but don't give it all your breath, because you're still here, still growing, still becoming someone who remembers, yes, but who also knows when to put the memory down, close their eyes and rest. Some memories don't knock, they just walk in the middle of brushing your teeth, while stirring tea, in the pause between songs. You never invite them, but they arrive with the same heaviness, the same strange familiarity, like a house guest who forgot they no longer live here. And they never come empty-handed. They bring back the feeling, the lump in your throat, the sting in your chest, the quiet ache that pulls your shoulders inward. You thought you had processed it, moved on, buried it somewhere deep. But memory is patient. It waits until you're softer, quieter, more open. Then it slips back in. You used to brace yourself, as if anticipating pain could make it hurt less. You'd try to distract yourself when the thoughts came, fill the room with noise, reach for anything that might keep the past at arm's length. But the more you resisted, the more it lingered, because memory doesn't need permission. It lives in your body, not just your mind, in your hands, in your breath, in the way you tense up when someone uses a certain tone, in the way your chest tightens during a silence that feels too familiar. It's not just the bad moments you remember, it's the almost so, the could have beens, the softness before the sharpness, the way someone looked at you right before everything fell apart, that moment of suspended belief, where everything still felt safe. You replay those fragments, not because you want to stay stuck, but because part of you is still trying to understand how it all shifted. You're still trying to locate the exact moment things changed, like finding the crack in a glass you didn't know was breaking until it shattered. Some nights you remember so vividly that it feels like time folds in on itself. You can feel the weight of a hand on your shoulder, the exact phrasing of a sentence, the smell of something that no longer exists. You reach for your phone out of habit, only to pull your hand back, because you know there's nothing left to say. The moment is over, the person is gone, but your body doesn't know that. It still waits, still listens, still remembers the silence that followed as if it might one day answer itself. You've learned how to live alongside these memories, not in resistance, but in rhythm. Some days they pass through you like a breeze, gentle, nostalgic, almost sweet. Other days they knock the wind out of you. You never know which version will come, but you've stopped being surprised, because remembering has become part of your routine, a background hum, a language your heart speaks when no one is listening. And yet it's lonely, isn't it? To remember so much while others have clearly moved on, to carry a story that only exists in your head now, to sit at a table with people who don't know what's playing behind your smile. You've stopped telling the full truth when someone asks how you're doing, because how do you explain that you're fine, but also full of scenes that won't stop replaying? How do you describe that you're okay on the outside, but inside you're still standing in doorways that no longer exist? There's a guilt that comes with remembering too, as if holding on means you're refusing to grow, as if healing means forgetting, but it doesn't. Healing is not erasure. Healing is learning how to hold memory without letting it pull you under. It's learning how to breathe even as you carry the weight. It's being able to say, yes, that happened, without crumbling every time the thought surfaces. You think back to things you wish you could unsee, words you wish were never said, things you wish you didn't still feel. But you also remember moments of pure softness, the way someone made you laugh when you didn't think you could, the warmth of being known, even if it didn't last. And that duality, the ache and the gratitude, is what makes memory so powerful, so confusing, so human. You've come to understand that memory is less about the past, and more about the pieces of you that formed because of it, who you became because of what you lost, how you learned to be gentler because of the pain, how your empathy deepened because of what you survived. These are not small things. These are foundations. And though the memory still stings, you can feel that something inside you is stronger now, quieter, maybe, but stronger. Tonight, if the memories return again, let them. Don't chase them away. Don't fight their arrival. Just let them pass through, like wind through an open room. Let them speak, then let them leave. You don't have to make meaning out of everything. Some things just happened. Some pain was real. And yet here you are, still breathing, still growing, still remembering, not because you're stuck, but because you loved deeply, because you lived fully, because your heart hasn't forgotten how much it felt. And that, in its own way, is beautiful. Even now, even still, there are days when memory feels like a quiet betrayal, how it brings back voices you no longer hear, hands you no longer hold, places that don't feel like home anymore, and yet your mind returns to them, faithfully, almost lovingly, like a loyal companion, walking you through the old corridors of your life, pointing at cracked walls and saying, "This is where you broke, and this is where you kept going anyway." It doesn't do it to hurt you. It does it because it doesn't know how to forget. You never asked to carry this much. You never volunteered to become a museum for things that didn't last. But here you are, curating moments, preserving them in detail even when they've long since faded for everyone else. Someone might say a name, and you'll remember the exact way it felt to hear it the first time. Someone might laugh a certain way, and you'll be transported back to a car ride, a conversation, a look across a room. You weren't trying to time travel, you were just existing. But memory pulls you anyway. It's not weakness, it's not a flaw, it's just how you're built. You feel in echoes, you live in layers. Even when you're moving forward, some part of you is gently looking back, not to dwell but to understand, to honor what was real. Because even if the people are gone, the love was not a mistake. Even if the chapter ended, the pages still matter. But it's tiring, isn't it? Carrying this invisible world while trying to stay present in the one around you. People see you, smile at you, ask how your day is going, and you answer. Of course you answer. But inside, you're sifting through a memory that just showed up unannounced, demanding your attention. It doesn't matter what triggered it. A smell, a phrase, a certain kind of silence. It's back, and now you're holding it with both hands while pretending everything is fine. You wonder sometimes what life would feel like with a quieter mind, if forgetting came easier, if you could walk through a place without hearing a past version of yourself laughing nearby, if you could meet someone new without remembering all the ways someone old once made you feel safe. But you've never known that version of life. Yours has always been layered with memory, threaded with nostalgia, soaked in the kind of tenderness that sometimes feels like longing. Still, you've learned to live with it, not in resistance but in rhythm. You don't fight your memories the way you used to. You don't push them down as forcefully. Now when they show up, you greet them softly. You let them sit beside you for a while. You let them speak. And then gently you say, "Thank you for coming, but I need to rest now." And sometimes they listen, sometimes they leave. You've realized that some memories return not because you're stuck, but because they're unfinished. Because some part of you still wants to be heard, not for closure, not for rewriting, just for recognition. To say, yes, this happened, yes, it mattered, yes, I'm still healing from it. And that acknowledgement alone can soften the sharpness. That gentle witnessing can change the shape of the memory itself. It's a quiet kind of bravery. What you do, waking up each day with a heart that remembers everything, and still choosing to show up to love again, to laugh, to try, that takes strength. Not the loud kind people celebrate, but the soft kind that keeps going even when no one's watching. The kind that says, "I may not forget, but I will live anyway." There's beauty in that, in remembering deeply, but not letting it consume you. In honoring the past without being held hostage by it. In letting your memories exist without letting them make every decision. You're learning to let go, not by forgetting, but by no longer needing to hold it all so tightly. So when the memory arrives again tomorrow, or next week, or in 10 years, let it come, let it say what it needs to. Then breathe, place it down gently, and return to now. Because even though you remember too much too often, you're still here, and this moment too will one day be a memory. Let it be one you live fully, let it be one you choose. It always starts the same way. You lie down, the room finally quiet, the weight of the day easing off your shoulders, but your mind refuses to follow. The light is off, your body still, but inside you're moving, rewinding, reviewing, replaying the same moments again and again, like a scene stuck on loop. You don't plan to go back there. You never do. But some part of your mind slips the key into a door you promised you'd stop opening. And suddenly, it's not tonight anymore. It's then. You stare at the ceiling, not really seeing it. Your eyes move across shadows, but your mind's busy projecting memories like old film. It plays out clearly, the way their voice sounded when they said your name that last time. The pause between their words, the part where you laughed, even though you didn't feel like laughing, just to keep things from falling apart too fast. You remember it all with a precision that feels cruel, like your brain is trying to punish your heart for something it didn't choose. You go over everything you said, every gesture, every silence. You think about the moment you looked away too soon, the way you folded your arms, the way they hesitated just before they said goodbye, and you wonder, was that the moment? Was that where it all shifted? Could something have been different if you had stayed one more second, if you had said one more thing, if your voice hadn't cracked when you tried to hold yourself together? But the truth is, you don't really want to rewrite it. You just want to understand it. You want to make sense of why something that once felt so solid slipped through your fingers without warning. That's the part that won't let you sleep. Not the ending, but the not knowing, the ambiguity, the pieces that don't line up no matter how many times you rearrange them in your mind. You tell yourself to stop. You try grounding exercises, breathing techniques, counting backwards from 100, but nothing quiets the ache. Nothing turns down the volume of memory once it starts playing. You're not just remembering, you're reliving. And your heart doesn't know the difference. It starts racing, like it did back then. Your chest tightens, your throat catches. Even though you know it's over, some part of you hasn't left that room, that moment, that goodbye. You think about things you should have said. How maybe, if you'd just been a little more open, a little more vulnerable, it would have changed something. But you weren't ready then. You didn't know how to say, please don't go, please stay long enough to understand me. And now that the words have found you, there's no one left to say them to. Just a pillow, just the dark, just the sound of your breath, a little more uneven than it was an hour ago. You wonder if they ever replay it too. If somewhere on some night like this, their mind also drifts back to you. If they remember the way your voice softened when you were tired, or the way you turned toward the window when you were scared, you wonder if you ever echo in someone else's silence. But you don't reach out. You don't ask, because even if the answer is yes, it won't change anything. And even if it's no, it'll still hurt the same. There's a strange comfort in the ritual of remembering. Like even though it breaks you open, it's the only thing that still connects you to what once was. You know it's not healthy. You know it keeps you tethered. But on nights like this, when the world is too quiet and your chest is too loud, memory feels like the only thing that still knows your name. You shift in bed, hoping that changing positions might shake the thoughts loose, but the weight of them follows, not heavy enough to crush you, but just enough to keep you awake. You check the time. It's late. It's always late when memory knocks, and even though you're exhausted, sleep feels miles away, guarded by thoughts you haven't finished thinking, by feelings you haven't finished feeling. You know you'll wake up tomorrow and move through the day like normal. You'll smile. You'll laugh. You'll do your work. But tonight you are here, stuck between what was and what could have been, trying to make peace with a story that never gave you the ending you needed. And maybe that's why you keep replaying it. Not to change it, but to understand how something so full could end so silently. You let out a quiet breath and pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders. You tell yourself you'll try to sleep soon, that you'll stop thinking about it After one more memory, one more loop, but you know better. This is the night you'll carry it again. Just like the last time. Just like every time the silence feels too familiar. Because some stories don't end when they end. Some stories echo long after the last word. You always hope it'll be different the next time. That maybe tonight memory will skip over the sharpest parts. That maybe you'll be able to remember softly, like tracing an old photograph with gentle fingers, instead of holding a shard of glass. But it never works that way. Memory has its favorite scenes, and they never change. They're stitched into your mind with invisible thread, woven through moments that should have faded by now. But instead they sharpen with age. Clearer, brighter, heavier. You remember what you were wearing that day. You remember what time it was. You remember the way the light looked on the floor, and how you almost said something important, but didn't. That's the moment that always haunts you. The breath you held instead of the truth you swallowed. It wasn't fear. Exactly. It was more like the weight of not wanting to make things worse. You thought holding it in would keep things intact. But silence, as you've learned, has its own way of breaking things. You return to that conversation again. The one where everything felt fine, almost too fine, like the stillness before a storm. You remember laughing. You remember their half smile. You remember the way their eyes kept flickering toward the door. And you didn't ask why. You didn't want the answer. You just wanted the moment to stretch a little longer. You convinced yourself there would be more time, that it wasn't the end, that people don't just disappear without a sound, but sometimes they do. There's a cruelty in the way the mind recalls what the heart hasn't healed from. You didn't ask to remember the smell of their sweater, or the exact phrasing of the last thing they said. But it's there. All of it pressed into your bones like a bruise, that never fully fades. You carry their voice like a song that only plays when the rest of the world goes quiet. And when it does, you hear it again, clearer than anything in the room around you. Sometimes you wish memory had an off switch, that you could choose what stays, and what fades, that you could trade the ache of remembering for the numbness of forgetting. But that's never been your way. You remember because it mattered. You remember because they mattered, even if they left. Even if they chose distance, even if they don't think of you at all anymore, their absence doesn't erase the presence they once held. You try to distract yourself. You scroll, you breathe, you drink water, but your mind pulls you back, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it thinks there's something left to solve. Like if you just replay it one more time, you'll figure out what you missed. Like maybe there's a secret thread, a hidden clue that explains everything, but it never comes. Just the same scenes, the same questions, the same silence after it all. You wonder if they remember any of it, if their mind ever drifts the way yours does, if they ever sit in bed and feel the tug of something unfinished. You know better than to reach out. You know silence often means closure for them, even if it doesn't for you. But the wondering stays. It always stays, a soft ache under your ribs, that doesn't ask for attention, only space. And while the rest of the world sleeps peacefully, you remain in between past and present, between letting go and holding on, between what happened and what never had the chance to. You whisper to yourself that it's okay, that some nights are just like this, that your heart is not broken, just remembering too hard. Eventually your eyes will grow heavy, not because the thoughts have stopped, but because your body can only hold so much at once. You'll drift off not with peace, but with fatigue. And when morning comes, you'll fold the memory up again, tucking it away like something sacred. Not because it's good, not because it doesn't hurt, but because it's yours, because it meant something, because no matter how much time passes, some nights will always carry the weight of what you never got to say. You woke up the next morning, like you always do, quiet, slow, heavy with the weight of a night spent inside memories that wouldn't let you rest. There was no evidence of it, no trace of how far back your heart had traveled. Just you, sitting on the edge of your bed, with tired eyes and a chest that still felt too full. The sun came through the window, like it always does, too bright for how dull your body felt. And for a second you wondered if they'd thought of you too. Just once, even briefly, even as a flicker between dreams. You moved through your routine on autopilot, brushing your teeth while staring at nothing, making tea without tasting it, opening your phone and closing it again, just to quiet the urge to look for signs, updates, photos, shadows of their life continuing without you. You told yourself not to check. You told yourself not to want. But desire is sneaky. It doesn't always look like longing. Sometimes it just looks like curiosity, with a heartbeat. All day you carried the weight of things unsaid, not just from last night, but from every night like it. Nights where you rehearsed forgiveness, crafted replies, imagined reconciliation in 100 different forms, but none of them ever happened. And yet your mind keeps making new versions, new edits, as if the story will hurt less if you can find a better ending. But even your dreams know the truth. Some endings are just echoes. They don't come with closure, only silence. You remembered the last time they looked at you, and meant it, really meant it. You can still feel the way it lit up something inside you that had been sleeping for years. And you also remember how that same light slowly dimmed, how they stopped asking as many questions, how they said goodnight, with less warmth, how their presence began to feel like an absence that hadn't left yet. And you, always hopeful, kept trying to pull them back with softness, not realizing they had already started leaving with silence. It's the smallest memories that catch you off guard, not the big moments, not the dramatic ones, but the small, ordinary details. The way they held their mug with both hands, the way their nose crinkled just slightly when they were confused, the way their voice softened when they were half asleep. You didn't think those things would matter, but now they're the parts you remember most, the parts you dream about, the parts you miss when everything else feels manageable. Sometimes you wonder if your mind does this to protect you or punish you, if it replays things because it thinks it's keeping something alive, or because it doesn't know how to bury it. You tell yourself it's normal, that everyone remembers something too much, but it doesn't feel normal at 3 a.m. It doesn't feel normal when the past becomes louder than the present, when your chest aches like it just happened yesterday, even though the calendar insists it's been years. You want to forget, but not entirely, not all of it. You want to remember without hurting. You want to hold the memory like a photograph, not a wound. You want to be able to say yes, that happened, without your voice trembling. You want peace more than you want answers now. And that's how you know you're healing, slowly, quietly, in your own way. Because even though the nights still come and the memories still visit, they don't hold you hostage the way they used to. You've started talking back to them, whispering to the past, I see you, but I'm not staying here tonight. And some nights it listens, some nights it fades. You're learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering differently. It means standing in the same old memory and noticing that it hurts a little less, that the version of you who lived it isn't the same as the one who's remembering it now. You've grown, even if you don't always feel it, even if you still wake up with a heart that sometimes looks back. And maybe that's the quiet triumph of it all, not erasing the pain, but surviving it, not closing the chapter, but continuing anyway, not because you stopped caring, but because you started choosing yourself, again and again, even on the nights you replay it all, even on the mornings after, even now.
It's such a small thing, barely noticeable to most. A pause, a breath, a flicker of hesitation before you speak. But for you, that moment is everything. It's where the fear lives. It's where your mind races ahead, scanning for risk, measuring the weight of your words before they even leave your lips. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that speaking came with consequences, that the wrong sentence could shift everything, that being too honest, too emotional, too much, might make someone go quiet, might make someone leave. So you pause, not just to think, but to protect, to shrink yourself into something more palatable. You soften your tone, change your phrasing, even switch topics mid-thought, because something inside you whispers, "Don't say that, don't be that." You've trained yourself to be easy to digest, even when you're full of complicated feelings. You call it being careful. Others call it being polite. But deep down, you know it's fear dressed up as control. You weren't always like this. There was a time you spoke freely, laughed loudly, said things without rehearsing them in your head a dozen times first. But over time, people's reactions shaped you. A raised eyebrow, a harsh reply, a silence that lasted too long, and little by little, you started holding back. Not just your words, but parts of yourself, your opinions, your emotions, your truth. You told yourself it was maturity, that thinking before you speak is wise. And sometimes it is, but not when the thinking turns into silence, not when the silence turns into erasure. You pause before speaking because you've been punished for being real. Maybe not directly, but subtly, through withdrawal, through distance, through being told you're too sensitive, or too intense, or too dramatic. And those labels stick, they grow roots in your throat. So now, every time you feel something deeply, it has to pass through filters. Is this safe to say? Will they still love me if they hear this part of me? Will they leave if I speak my mind? That kind of second guessing becomes exhausting. It doesn't just drain your energy, it erodes your sense of self, because when you're constantly editing, you lose track of what the original sentence even was. You forget what your voice sounds like unfiltered. You forget what it feels like to speak, and not brace for impact. And then there's the guilt. The quiet guilt that follows you when you don't say the thing. When the moment passes, and you're left with a full chest and empty air, you replay the conversation later, wondering how different it could have felt if you'd just been honest. If you'd let yourself say, "That hurt," or "I'm scared," or even "I need you right now." But the words stayed stuck, and now all you have is silence and the regret of choosing it. People don't always notice your pauses. They don't see the storm behind your smile. They don't know how many things you swallowed just to keep the peace. But you feel it. You feel it in your body, in your jaw, in your chest, in the tension that never fully goes away. It's not just emotional, it's physical. Your silence takes up space in you, even when it gives space to others. Sometimes you wonder what it would feel like to speak without fear, to let your words come as they are, unpolished, unrehearsed, unfiltered, to believe that the people who matter will understand, will stay, will hold what you give them, even if it's heavy. But that kind of safety feels rare, maybe mythical. So instead you pause, you pull back, you adjust. But you're starting to notice the cost. You're starting to feel how much of yourself gets lost in that pause. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness is the first step back to your voice. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, gently, one truth at a time. You deserve to speak without fear. You deserve to be heard without apology. You deserve to take up space, even in silence. And one day, when you feel ready, you'll pause not out of fear, but out of care, out of presence, out of the deep understanding that your voice is not a danger, it's a gift, and it always has been. There's a moment just before your voice rises, where everything inside you runs through a silent checklist. Will this make them uncomfortable? Will they misunderstand me? Will they pull away? And before you can even breathe in, the thought becomes a filter. What began as an honest feeling now turns into a negotiation between your heart and your history, between what you want to say and what you think the world can handle. You don't just speak, you scan, you calculate, you soften. Because you've learnt that even truth can cost you something, if spoken too soon, too raw, too real. That pause, however brief, has become your safety net. But it's also become a cage. It's where all the things you didn't say go to live. It's where your frustration sits quietly in your chest, hoping someone will notice the tension in your jaw, the glance to the floor, the way your voice gets just a little quieter. But they don't. Most people don't. They hear what you do say, and never question what you've left out. And maybe that's the part that stings the most, how good you've become at sounding fine when you're actually not. You've taught yourself to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to smile even when something aches inside you. You've been praised for being composed, mature, understanding, but what they call grace was often survival. It was you learning to navigate rooms where your emotions weren't welcome. It was you learning that being heard wasn't guaranteed, so you'd better be precise, gentle, likable. And now, even when you're with people who love you, your tongue still holds back, just in case. Because fear doesn't care how safe you are now, it only remembers how unsafe you were then. The irony is that you want to be known, truly known, not just for your kindness or your ability to listen, but for your edges, your depth, your complexity. You want to be known for your thoughts that don't always end in easy resolutions, for the moments you feel messy, unsure, overwhelmed. But being known requires being heard, and being heard requires speaking, and speaking, really speaking, requires risk. So you keep the truth in your pocket, waiting for the right moment that never quite arrives. You say what's expected, what's polite, what won't change the tone of the room. You nod when you mean to shake your head. You stay quiet when your heart wants to scream. And afterward you feel it, that heavy hum inside you, like unfinished sentences echoing against your ribs. The ache of not choosing yourself in the moment you most needed to. And the people around you, they don't see the cost. They think your silence means peace. They think your pause means comfort. But it's not peace if it requires you to disappear. It's not comfort if it leaves you feeling hollow. They don't know how loud it is in your head when you're quiet. They don't realize that every "I'm okay" costs you another piece of yourself. Still, you keep hoping that one day someone will pause before they speak, not to censor themselves but to make room for you. Someone who doesn't rush to fill the silence but sits in it with curiosity, with presence. Someone who notices your hesitation and says, "It's okay, take your time, I want to hear what you really mean." Because maybe all you've ever needed is that an invitation, not an interrogation. And maybe that person is you. Maybe it starts with you saying, "I don't have to apologize for the truth of who I am." Maybe it starts with you letting one unfiltered sentence leave your mouth, even if it trembles. Maybe it starts with trusting that the people who truly matter won't run from your honesty. Maybe they'll lean in. You're not too much. You're not too intense. You're not wrong for needing more than shallow conversation. You're someone who feels deeply, who listens closely, who thinks before speaking. And while that's a gift, it shouldn't be a muzzle. It shouldn't cost you your voice. Not anymore. So maybe next time, when the pause arrives, you'll take a breath and speak anyway. Not perfectly, not gently, but honestly. And in doing so, you'll remind your heart that its voice was never meant to be background noise. It was always meant to be heard. There are entire conversations you've rehearsed in your mind, but never allowed to leave your mouth. Words that sat on the edge of your lips, ready to leap, but got pulled back by a voice that wasn't entirely yours. A voice shaped by years of walking on emotional eggshells, of reading the room before you read yourself, of placing everyone else's comfort above your need to be understood. And so you paused, again and again, because somewhere along the way, your safety became tied to how quiet you could be, how little you could disturb the surface of things. You carry these unspoken things everywhere, like pages torn from a diary that no one will ever read. Sometimes they rise unexpectedly during a quiet car ride, when someone laughs a certain way, or when you're alone brushing your teeth and suddenly remember a moment where you stayed silent instead of saying what you meant. And even though it's long gone, you feel that moment again, how your stomach tightened, how your mouth dried up, how your whole being screamed to be seen but settled for being tolerated. You've learnt how to turn the volume down on your feelings, to speak only when you're sure your words won't cause discomfort. You've smiled through tension, you've changed your tone to keep things light. You've turned truths into questions so they wouldn't sound like demands. And yet, after all that effort, some people still left, some still misunderstood, some still made you feel like your honesty was a burden rather than a bridge. And that hurt. Not just because they left, but because you never even got to be fully yourself before they did. You started to believe that maybe the real you was too much, that if you spoke your truth in its full tone, in its raw, unedited form, it would push people away. So you kept pausing, you kept rehearsing, you kept hiding your real responses behind safe ones. And it worked on the surface. The room stayed calm, no one flinched, but inside you started to disappear, a little more each time. And yet you've always felt the ache to be known, to have someone look at you, and not just hear your words, but feel the truth behind them, to say what you feel in the moment, and not have it come back to you distorted. You want to feel free in your speech, not reckless but real. You want to feel like your honesty isn't a risk, but a rhythm, a way of living, not something to be survived. You think about the people who made you feel small when you were loud, who rolled their eyes when your emotions rose, who used silence like a weapon, who made you feel foolish for needing connection that didn't arrive in silence. And part of you still speaks with their judgment echoing inside your skull, still measures your tone with their reactions in mind, still tries to be enough, but not too much, present, but not overwhelming, honest, but not demanding, but your voice has waited long enough. It has sat through too many pauses. It has apologized too many times before it even got to speak. And you know now that this isn't about being polite. It's about being free. It's about reclaiming the right to speak before you're 100% sure it's safe. Because sometimes the safety comes from speaking anyway. Sometimes the healing isn't in the perfect word, but in the imperfect truth. You've always been thoughtful. That's beautiful. Your awareness of others is not a flaw, but your silence should never come at the cost of your authenticity. You can be kind and clear. You can be soft and still say what hurts. You can be afraid and still speak. These things are not opposites. They are the fullness of who you are. So maybe next time you feel that familiar pause, the breath before the sentence, you'll remember that your voice is not a disruption. It is a door. And the people who love you won't slam it shut when it opens. They'll listen. They'll stay. And if they don't, then maybe that moment was never safe to begin with. But at least now, you'll know that you showed up fully, that you gave your truth a place to live outside your chest. Because the goal was never just to be understood. The goal was to stop leaving pieces of yourself behind in every conversation. And now, slowly, you're beginning to bring them home, one sentence at a time.
There's something quietly painful about being asked how your day was, but never how your nights have been. About people assuming you're okay because you smile in the afternoon, never realizing how heavy the silence feels when the world goes dim. You've gotten good at answering the usual questions. How's work? How's everything going? But no one ever pauses to ask the one thing that matters lately. Are you sleeping? Are you resting? Or are the nights still full of noise no one else hears? Because the truth is, you haven't been sleeping. Not really. You lie down. Yes. You close your eyes. But your body doesn't settle. Your thoughts don't quiet. Your chest doesn't soften the way it should in the dark. Instead, it stays alert. Your mind scans through old messages, memories, half-finished thoughts. It combs through the day for missed signs, words that didn't land right, emotions you couldn't process in real time. And in that restless re-watching, sleep slips further away. It's not just insomnia, it's grief in disguise. It's loneliness with a soft voice. It's the way memory becomes louder when nothing else is competing for your attention. During the day, you know how to move. You know how to function. But the night exposes you. In the night, there's no one to smile for. No task to distract you. Just you, your mind, and all the weight you tried to carry quietly. You wish someone would ask. Not in passing, not with casual politeness, but really ask, look you in the eyes, and wonder if your nights are kind or cruel. Because that's where the truth hides. That's where the ache lives. Not in how you speak, but in how you sleep, or how you don't. And when no one asks, it starts to feel like no one wants to know. Like your exhaustion is invisible, because you've wrapped it in composure. And so you answer, I'm fine when you're asked how you are. You keep it light. You redirect the conversation, because the truth feels too heavy to say out loud. How do you explain that your bed has become a place of memory more than rest? That the pillow remembers the sound of your crying better than anyone else does? That you're tired, not just in your bones, but in your soul? You've tried the tricks. No screens before bed, chamomile tea, meditation apps, breathing exercises, but they don't silence the part of you that keeps reliving old wounds. They don't soothe the version of you that's still awake in some distant memory, waiting for a different ending. Your sleeplessness is not about routine. It's about what you carry, and what you carry rarely fits inside a wellness tip. Some nights you don't even fight it. You stay up with the ache. You open old messages. You scroll through photos you told yourself to delete. You draft replies you'll never send. It's not healthy maybe, but it feels honest. It feels like the only way to sit with the truth when no one else is awake to hold it with you. Because if no one asks, you might as well ask yourself, why am I still holding this? There are nights when the exhaustion wins, when you pass out with your phone still in your hand, a half-finished sentence glowing on the screen, and in the morning, You barely remember falling asleep. You just know that it wasn't rest. It was collapse. It was survival. It was your body giving in, because your heart couldn't carry it any longer. You've started pretending again, saying you slept okay, laughing about how everyone's tired these days. But your tired is different. Your tired isn't fixed with a nap. It's stitched into your skin. It shows up in the way your hands shake when you pour coffee, in the way your sentences trail off, in the way your chest tightens at the smallest reminder of something unfinished. It's all still there, and it leaks into everything. So when someone says you look tired, you smile and nod. You say, "Yeah, didn't sleep much." But what you want to say is, "I don't remember the last time I woke up rested." What you want is for someone to hear that, without rushing to fix it, without telling you to just try melatonin. You want someone to stay, to sit beside your weariness, to ask how your nights have been, not to analyze but to understand, because it's never really been about sleep, has it? It's about the ache beneath it, the silence that gets too loud when the lights go out, the truth that you only whisper in the dark, and the longing for someone, anyone, to meet you there and say, "I see you," even in the hours you think no one's watching, even in the hours where sleep won't come. There's a certain loneliness that only arrives at night, the kind that doesn't ask permission. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It just settles in beside you slowly, like fog creeping under a door, and you lie there facing the ceiling, hoping that maybe tonight will be different, that maybe your thoughts will be quieter, that maybe your heart won't replay the day or the year like a broken film reel. But the silence stretches long and deep, and before long you know exactly how this night will go, just like the last one, just like too many before it. You've started avoiding certain thoughts during the day, pretending you've moved past them. But night has a way of exposing what the daylight helps you hide. It pulls your guard down, gently until there's nothing left between you and the truth you've been avoiding. And then it begins, the looping of conversations, the images you can't unsee, the feelings you didn't have time to fully feel. You remember what you didn't say, or what they said that still echoes. You remember the pause after their message, the way it never came back, the door that stayed closed, and no one asks about this part of you. The version that keeps getting up in the middle of the night to pace the room. The version that watches the time shift from 2:13 to 3:41 to 4:07. The version that cries quietly so the world doesn't notice. Because everyone assumes that if you're still getting things done, still replying to texts, still showing up, that you must be fine. But fine doesn't explain the exhaustion behind your eyes. Fine doesn't account for the emotional labor of pretending you slept when your heart never shut down. You've become an expert at functioning while tired. You know how to sip coffee just slow enough to keep from shaking, how to smile at the right time, how to redirect the conversation when someone gets too close to asking what's really going on. And the longer you go without being asked, the harder it becomes to say anything at all. Because now if you bring it up, it feels like a burden, like introducing a storm into someone else's clear sky. So instead you hold it, all of it, until it holds you. It's not just sleep you're losing, it's the part of yourself that feels safe in the dark, the part that used to find comfort in stillness. You remember nights when sleep came easy, when dreams were soft places to land, but those feel far away now. Now night is a landscape of emotional survival, a place where your mind becomes louder than your heartbeat, a place where healing feels impossible, because you're too tired to keep trying, and too wired to let go. And maybe that's the hardest part, how trapped it makes you feel, because you're tired, but rest doesn't come, because you're hurting, but no one sees, because you want to say something, but you don't know how to start. You don't want to be dramatic, you don't want to be a weight someone has to carry. So you carry yourself over and over, across each sleepless night, like a person walking in circles hoping the path eventually changes. You've started to dread bedtime, not because of nightmares, but because of the quiet, because of how loud it becomes, because of how long the hours feel when you're the only one awake. You scroll until your phone burns in your hands. You read old messages, open empty chats, wonder what it would be like to send a message at 3:12 a.m. and have someone answer, to have someone say, "I'm up too, tell me what's on your mind." But you never do, because vulnerability at night feels more fragile than it does in the light. So you let the night pass again. You let morning find you in pieces. You pull yourself together enough to be functional. You drink more water. You avoid mirrors. You tell yourself tonight will be better. But part of you doesn't believe it. Part of you has made peace with the fact that this is just how it is now. That this is what healing looks like. Exhausting, lonely, unseen. And yet there's still a tiny part of you, quiet and persistent, that hopes that one day someone will sit beside you, not in the daylight, not during the laughter, but in the dark. Someone who doesn't need an invitation to care. Someone who notices when you're too tired to pretend. Someone who asks not how your day was, but how your night really felt. Someone who listens when you say, "I didn't sleep again," and doesn't offer advice, just presence, just warmth, just enough silence to remind you that you're not the only one awake. You've become fluent in the language of sleep deprivation, not just the physical weight of tired eyes, but the emotional numbness that follows too many nights without rest. There's a dullness in your reactions now, like your emotions are muffled under blankets of fatigue. You smile slower. You process joy like it's passing through thick glass. Even good moments feel faded around the edges, and no one sees it. No one notices how much you're surviving rather than living, because on the outside you look the same, but inside you're carrying nights no one asked about. You sit across from people in cafes, in living rooms, in office meetings, and they comment on the weather, on plans for the weekend, on something light, and you nod. You contribute, but inside you're wondering why no one notices how heavy your body feels, how your laughter sounds a little off, how the space between your sentences is filled with the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. You keep waiting for someone to see past the surface and ask something different, something real, but they don't. And so you keep rehearsing your lines, pretending the nights don't leave bruises. You've mastered the art of the early alarm. You wake up before the world demands you to, just to buy yourself a moment of stillness, before you have to wear the mask again. You scroll quietly, sit in the bathroom longer than necessary, sip your coffee in a kind of sacred solitude. It's the only time you feel honest. The only time your tired heart doesn't have to perform. But even then, there's a weight to it, a knowing that soon you'll step back into the role, and no one will know what it cost you just to show up. You keep thinking it'll pass, that if you just make it through this week, this month, this season, maybe sleep will return, maybe your thoughts will quiet, maybe you'll stop flinching at silence. But deep down, you're not sure anymore, because this isn't just about sleep, it's about loneliness, about the kind that lingers even when you're not alone, about the ache of not being asked the right questions, of not being seen in the moments that matter most, when your soul is tired and your mask is slipping, and you just need someone to notice. You've tried talking about it before, in small ways, dropping hints, saying things like "I didn't sleep great," or "my mind's been kind of full lately." But people nod and move on. They offer surface-level sympathy, maybe a joke about caffeine, and you smile along, because what else can you do? It's hard to go deeper when no one invites it. It's hard to say, "Actually, I've been carrying more than I can name," and the nights are when it all crashes down. So you don't. You bury it. Again, but you're tired, not just from the lack of sleep, but from holding all of this by yourself, from pretending the dark doesn't change you, from pretending the night is just another part of the day. It's not. It's where your real self shows up. The one who doesn't have to smile, who doesn't have to explain, who just wants to be held in stillness. And you're starting to realize that you deserve that your need for rest, for understanding, for presence in the quiet, is not a weakness. It's human. So you sit with yourself a little differently now. You light a candle before bed, not to fix anything, but to honor the part of you that's been carrying so much. You wrap yourself in softness. You breathe deeper, not to chase sleep, but to remind your body that it's still yours. You start to write things down, not for answers, but for release. You begin treating the night not as an enemy, but as a space you're allowed to fill with gentleness. Not solutions, just care. And maybe no one has asked yet. Maybe the people around you haven't learned to notice what hides behind a tired smile, but you're learning to ask yourself, to check in, to say, how are you sleeping? Really, not with judgment, but with compassion, with the kind of softness you've always deserved, but didn't know how to give. And in that asking, in that small act of witnessing, something begins to shift, because healing doesn't always come from being heard by others. Sometimes, it starts with hearing yourself, with recognizing your own ache, and whispering back, I'm here, I see you. Even in the hours no one else does, especially then, and maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of rest. Not sleep, not yet, but rest, the kind that holds you through the dark, and promises gently that you won't always have to carry this alone.
Somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a hallway of unfinished sentences. Doors left slightly open. Words still hovering in the air, untouched, unspoken. You carry them with you, not out of choice, but because they never settled, they never landed. They were cut short, interrupted, walked away from, and now, long after the moment has passed, they still echo, not loudly, not all the time, but enough. Enough to make you turn your head when no one's there. Enough to make your chest tighten when you read something that sounds like them. Enough to remind you that silence can be loud, especially when it arrives before the story was ready to end. You didn't always realize you were carrying them. At first, they were just thoughts, things you should have said or hoped you might still get to. But then time passed, the distance grew, and no one came back to pick up the pieces. No one asked, what were you going to say that night? What did you mean when your voice broke in the middle of that sentence? So you said it to yourself instead, over and over. You finished both sides of the conversation. You imagined their reaction. You softened your tone. You tried to find the words that might have changed things. But the silence never answered back. You remember the way they looked at you in that last exchange, how their eyes said more than their mouth ever did. You remember the moment you hesitated, hoping they'd ask you to continue, but they didn't. They closed the door with a smile or a shrug or a glance at their phone, and it left you suspended. No goodbye, no resolution, just a feeling that something important was left behind. Something that might have explained everything, something that might have saved the connection from fading into shadow. And even now, you still return to those moments. In the middle of errands, in the soft light before sleep, in the pause after someone says your name with just the right tone. You return because the body doesn't forget unfinished pain. The mind doesn't erase conversations that were never allowed to end. You find yourself responding to things no one said in years. You find yourself defending emotions that were never challenged. You fight for clarity inside your own chest, long after the other person has gone quiet. It's a lonely thing, carrying conversations alone. You start to question if they ever cared as much as you did, if they even remember the moment you've replayed 100 times. If your silence afterward meant anything to them. But then another part of you whispers that maybe they were carrying their own version too. Maybe they didn't know how to stay. Maybe they were waiting for you to speak. And maybe your silence looked like peace to them, when it was really just protection.
Still, the dialogue continues inside you. You write it in your head, shape it while walking alone, mouth the words in front of mirrors, draft texts you'll never send. You wonder what would happen if you said it now, if you reached out, if you asked for a final sentence. But something holds you back. Not pride, not fear, just the quiet understanding that some conversations weren't meant to end with closure. Some were meant to echo, to linger, to shape you in ways you didn't expect. And it has shaped you. You're more careful now. You choose your words with more weight. You listen differently. You don't interrupt even when it hurts, because you know what it's like to carry a sentence with no end. You know the ache of something unsaid becoming something unshakable. So you stay present. You let others finish. You hold space, not because they asked, but because you wish someone had done the same for you. You don't talk about it much. The unfinishedness, the emotional residue. It's hard to explain how something that never concluded can still feel so heavy, how you can still miss a voice you haven't heard in years, how the ache of an incomplete exchange can outlast even the deepest goodbyes. But you know it's real. You feel it in the pause between your own words. You feel it in the way you soften when others hesitate. You feel it in the tears that come for no clear reason, only memory. And maybe that's what healing looks like now. Not fixing the conversation, but honoring it, not chasing the last word, but acknowledging what was left behind. Maybe the story wasn't meant to be finished. Maybe it was meant to teach you how to hold things gently, how to carry pain without letting it harden you, how to let an echo exist without turning it into a cage. So tonight, when that voice returns, when that unfinished conversation starts playing again, you let it, you listen, you say the thing, you finish the sentence, not for them, for you, because your voice still matters, even now, even still. There are nights when it feels like they're right there again, not physically, not really, but close enough in memory to make your breath catch. Their voice returns with startling clarity, each word playing out exactly as it once did. And then comes the part that never happened, the sentence you wish you'd said, the reply they never gave. You hear it anyway. Your mind fills in the silence with your best guess. You argue, you explain, you soften, you ache. The conversation that ended too early becomes a nightly ritual that no one else sees. It doesn't bring closure, but for a moment it feels like you're not alone with the ghost of it all. Sometimes it happens in public. You'll hear something, a tone, a phrase, a laugh, and suddenly you're back in the middle of something you never got to finish. Your body tenses as if preparing to defend itself. Your mind sharpens, already formulating the words you never got to say. But there's no one there, just you. Just the memory, uninvited and still hungry for resolution. It's not that you haven't moved on. You have, in all the ways people measure. But grief for the unsaid doesn't care about calendars. It cares about meaning, about the weight of what stayed inside. You wonder if they felt the same pull, in the quiet, if they ever sat with the sentence you couldn't speak, if their silence was really strength, or simply avoidance. You try not to linger on it, but it lingers on you. You can't rewrite the past, but it rewrites you. Every unfinished exchange becomes a room in your mind, and you walk those rooms when the world goes still. You touch the walls, you listen for footsteps, you wonder if the door will ever creak open, but it never does. Only you visit, only you remember what almost was. There's a tenderness to it, strangely, a strange reverence, because even in its ache the conversation mattered, even in its incompletion, it was real. You learned something in that silence about them, yes, but mostly about yourself, about the things you wish you'd said sooner, about how long you're willing to wait for clarity, about how it feels to lose something without knowing if it was ever really yours. These unfinished conversations don't just haunt you, they shape you, quietly, patiently, sentence by unsaid sentence, and it's not always painful. Sometimes it's soft, sometimes you smile, at the thought of what you could have said, at how different you are now, at the growth hidden inside the ache. You see yourself in the memory, not just the wounded version, but the brave one, the one who stayed kind despite the silence, the one who held space even when it went unacknowledged, the one who kept caring, long after the words stopped. But still, there are days you wish you'd said it. Whatever it was, that final truth, that piece of clarity, the part that felt too big to risk, too raw to voice. You think maybe things would have made more sense if you'd been able to give it language. But the moment passed, and what was left behind wasn't just silence. It was tension, suspended energy, a page mid-turn, a chapter with no period, and that kind of silence writes itself into your bones. So you carry it, not because you want to, but because it never found a place to land, and in carrying it you've become more careful. You've started asking questions differently, you've started listening longer, you wait now, you pause, you make space for other people's unfinishedness, because you know how much it hurts to walk away from a moment that needed just one more sentence. You're beginning to understand that some conversations don't end, they echo, they stay alive in the questions they left behind. And maybe healing isn't about finding the ending. Maybe it's about being the one who finally stops waiting for it, who says, I deserved better than silence. I deserved a voice, even if they weren't ready to hear it. And with that knowing, maybe the conversation finally shifts, not into closure, but into something quieter, something more kind. Tonight, if the words return again, you'll let them rise. You'll finish what you couldn't say, not to be heard, but to be free. You'll sit with the version of yourself that still waits for a reply, and whisper gently, it's okay now. We've said all we needed to say, even if no one else is listening. Your heart is, and sometimes that's the only audience that truly matters. There's a unique kind of tiredness that comes from holding dialogue that never had the chance to unfold, from being both the speaker and the listener, night after night, from having to live inside a memory where you're still trying to understand what went wrong, still trying to say what you never got to say. It's not about blame anymore. It rarely is. It's about weight, the weight of having carried the same questions for so long that they've become part of how your mind moves. A rhythm you didn't choose, but now know too well. You've tried to silence it. You've distracted yourself with work, with noise, with movement. You've surrounded yourself with people who speak, who laugh, who fill the room with so much sound that your own mind feels like it might finally go quiet. But it never does, because even in the loudest spaces, the unsaid waits, not for the right time, but for the vulnerable one, for the moment your guard slips, and your hands aren't full, and you're finally still enough to hear it. The memory returns. The conversation begins again. You don't talk about it anymore, not because it doesn't matter, but because you've learned most people don't know what to say in response. They offer advice when what you need is space. They try to solve what isn't a puzzle, but a process. So now you keep it inside. You nod when people say let it go, knowing they've never had to carry something that had no goodbye. You smile when they say you'll get closure someday, knowing not every story ends neatly. Some just stop. And yet for all the ache, there's a strange intimacy in this remembering, this deep holding of moments no one else remembers. You still recall the exact words that were spoken, the way the air felt, the texture of silence between your breaths. You remember how close they sat, how far away they felt. You remember trying to hold yourself together, while also trying not to disappear. You remember wanting one more sentence, one more pause to fill with truth, one more moment of being heard before it all went quiet. You tell yourself that if they wanted to know how you felt, they would have asked. If they wanted to stay, they would have stayed. And logically, You know this is true, but emotions don't answer to logic. They answer to memory. They answer to the soft voice that still wonders, did they know how much I was holding back? Did they ever want to understand? Or were they always halfway out the door? These questions don't seek replies anymore. They just live inside you. Familiar, persistent, soft. It's not about changing the past. You've stopped hoping for that. It's about honoring the version of you that never got the chance to speak freely, the version that held it all in, that chose silence to preserve peace, that chose self-erasure over the risk of rejection. And even though it kept you safe, it also kept you small. And now part of your healing is letting that version step forward, letting them finally say, this is what I wanted to tell you, this is what I needed you to hear. You write letters you'll never send. You speak aloud in empty rooms. You type things in your notes app at midnight. And though the words may never reach the person they were meant for, they still matter, because they're real, because they're yours, because they carry the weight of your honesty, and that deserves to be seen, even if only by your own heart. And slowly, that conversation you've carried begins to shift. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes lighter, less of a demand, more of a memory, something you once held close, now placed gently on a shelf. It still belongs to you, but it no longer defines you. It no longer breaks you open just by arriving. You've made peace with the silence, not because you agree with it, but because you've stopped waiting for it to change. Tonight, if it comes again, you'll listen. You won't fight it. You'll let the words finish themselves. You'll let the moment breathe, one last time, and then gently, you'll whisper back, thank you, I hear you, I'm ready to rest now, because the story may have ended without an answer, but you don't have to. You are allowed to continue, even with the unfinished, especially with the unfinished.
There are things they let go of easily, moments, phrases, shared glances that to them were small, forgettable. You watched them drift away from those fragments like they held no weight, no history, but not you. You picked them up and tucked them away like keepsakes. You still remember the exact sound of their laugh when they weren't trying to be polite. You still remember the way they looked at you during that one conversation when neither of you said what you truly meant. They forgot. Or maybe they never noticed, but you did. And you still whisper those memories back to yourself when no one's listening. It's not a choice. Not really. It's just how you are. You remember the little things, the in-between silences, the slight shift in someone's tone that revealed everything they didn't want to say out loud. You've always listened harder than most, watched closer, felt deeper, which means you carry more too. They might not remember the late-night words, the unfinished messages, the way they used your name like it meant something, but those things still live inside you, still echo when the room is dark and quiet, and your heart feels just a little too open. Sometimes you try to forget too. You tell yourself it's time to let go, that if they could move on without even looking back, so should you. But letting go isn't the same as forgetting. Forgetting would require you to unfeel, to undo the emotional imprint their presence left behind. And that's not how your heart works. It doesn't forget what it once called home. It doesn't unknow what it learned in someone's eyes. So instead of forgetting, you soften. You stop fighting the memory. You hold it like a delicate photograph, worn at the edges, but still clear in the center. You whisper their name sometimes, not out loud, not to call them back, but just to remind yourself that it was real, that they existed in your life, even if only briefly, that your connection wasn't imagined, that the way they made you feel was something true. You whisper it like a lullaby, something tender and half sad, not because you expect them to return, but because your heart still remembers what your mind is trying to bury. And then there are the words they said carelessly,
words that fell from their mouth like feathers, light and forgettable. But they hit you like stones. You still hear them in your quiet moments, those lines that stung in ways they'll never know. They forgot. Or maybe they never even noticed the way you flinched, the way your breath caught for a second too long. But you did. You noticed everything. You always do. You've grown quieter because of it. Not in volume, but in expression. You speak with more thought now, more restraint. You know what it's like to be on the receiving end of words that linger for years, so you choose yours carefully. Not because you fear hurting others, but because you know how deep unintentional wounds can go. You've lived with them. You've healed from some. Others still sit in your chest, softer now but still there. People tell you to forget. They say you're too sensitive, that you hold on to things longer than you should. But they don't understand that you're not clinging to pain. You're honoring experience. You're not refusing to move on. You're just moving with memory instead of against it. You know what happened. You remember how it felt. And that matters. Even if no one else carries it. Even if they've already let it go. So when the night stretches long, and the silence feels heavy, you whisper the names, the moments, the soft echoes of conversations past. Not because you're stuck, but because you're remembering with grace. Because memory to you isn't a cage, it's a tribute. A quiet acknowledgement of what shaped you, what moved you, what hurt and what healed. And though they may have forgotten, you still remember, you still whisper. And in that whisper there is truth, there is presence, there is you. They moved on so quickly it felt like whiplash. Like one day you were part of their every thought, their every plan, and the next you became an afterthought. If even that. They smiled in photos, shared new stories, laughed with new people, while you were still standing in the doorway of a moment they no longer remembered. And yet despite all that, despite how casually they seemed to leave it all behind, you still hold on, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in reverence. Because even if they forgot the meaning in those ordinary moments, you never did. You still whisper the memories, because they remind you of who you were when you cared that deeply. You still see the way they looked at you during the last conversation before things changed, how their eyes flickered, just once, and you knew something was slipping away. You felt it. You always do. The shift. The pulling away. But you never stopped hoping it was just in your head. That maybe you were just tired. That maybe they'd stay if you stayed soft enough, patient enough, quiet enough. But people don't always leave loudly. Sometimes they just stop remembering the same things you do. You recall their voice. Not the surface version, the one they used with strangers, or during small talk, but the one they used when the world fell away, when they spoke like they were safe, like they were seen. That version is the one you still whisper when you think of them. Not the one who left, but the one who stayed, once when it still mattered, the one who sat beside you in silence, and didn't need to say a thing, because everything you both felt was already there in the air between you. But they forgot, or chose to. Life moved on. They met new people, found new routines, built new memories in places you'd never be invited into. And yet here you are, still speaking their name, like it carries warmth, still remembering the softness in their laugh, still hearing the way they once said, "Don't ever disappear on me." And maybe they don't even recall saying that. But you do, because you needed it, because you believed it, because it was the kind of promise your heart had been waiting for. And now it's a memory you whisper more gently than you ever did out loud. You don't want to admit how often they return in your thoughts, how something as small as a sunset, a song, a scent can pull them back into the present, like they never left. How even a sentence from a book can sound like something they once said. You try to push them away, you try to be logical, You remind yourself that people forget all the time, that they had every right to move on. But then you remember how it felt to be held in that kind of attention, how rare it was, how fleeting, and you whisper it back, not to bring them closer, but to remember how deeply
you once loved.
People tell you to let it go, to clear the space, to stop living in something that no longer exists. But they don't understand that this isn't about clinging to a person. It's about honoring what was real for you. It's about the fragments that built you, the tiny pieces of connection that taught you what it meant to be seen, even if only for a moment, and those don't just vanish. Not when you're someone who feels with your whole chest. Not when your memory holds more than just facts. It holds feeling, warmth, the texture of what once was. You've grown. Yes, you've outgrown the need for their presence, but that doesn't mean you've forgotten their impact. Healing doesn't erase memory, it reframes it, and you're learning to carry the echo of what they forgot without letting it hollow you. You're learning that just because they don't remember the way you do, doesn't make your experience less true. Some people build their lives forward. You build yours with careful layers, never forgetting what the foundation cost you. And in the stillest hours, when the world is too quiet and your mind is too loud, you still whisper, not to bring them back, not to reopen the wound, but to acknowledge the shape of love once given. To say, I remember, even if you don't, I carry it still, not because I have to, but because it mattered, and there's something sacred in that. Something whole, something they may never know, but something you will always honor. You've come to understand that remembering isn't weakness, it's a kind of strength, the quiet kind, the invisible kind, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition, but still shapes every step you take. They may have walked away with their hands empty, but you stayed behind with a heart full of fragments, sharp and soft and aching. They forgot the way they made you feel in the quietest moments. And yet those are the very moments that still echo in your chest, when the night becomes too still. You find pieces of them in places they've never been. A stranger's laugh that sounds like theirs. A song lyric that fits their silence too perfectly. The way someone says your name, almost the same way they used to, but never quite. It's not that you're looking for them in everything. It's that everything seems to remember them before you do. The world carries traces, whether or not they intended to leave them behind. And you carry those traces like they're part of your own story now, because they are. There were things you never got to say, things you rehearsed in your head 100 times, shaped like apology, like hope, like clarity. But life moved faster than your courage. Or maybe they stopped listening before you could gather the words. Either way, the space where those sentences should have lived still hums with energy. You find yourself writing them in the steam on the mirror, tracing them in notebooks you never show anyone, whispering them to the dark. Not because you expect anyone to answer, but because some truths deserve to be spoken, even if no one hears them. They don't know how much of you they took when they stopped remembering. They don't know how long you stood at the edge of that memory, waiting for a sign that it mattered to them too. But nothing came. No message. No small gesture of acknowledgement. Just time, stretching out, rewriting them into a person who seems to belong only to the past now. And maybe that's what hurts the most. Not that they left, but that they didn't even seem to notice what they left unfinished. But still, you remember. You keep the details alive. You hold them gently now. Not like wounds, but like old photographs. You stop trying to change the ending. You stop hoping they'll come back with the missing words. Instead, you write your own. You add softness where they left silence. You give yourself the closure they never did. And you realize, maybe for the first time, that you were never meant to forget. You were meant to transform. Because remembering isn't staying stuck. It's honoring what was real. It's choosing to keep the truth of your experience close, even when no one else can validate it. You loved, you felt, you stayed when it was hard. You saw meaning in moments others let slip through their fingers, and that matters. That always mattered. So tonight, like so many nights before, you might whisper their name again. You might revisit a memory you swore you'd buried, but you'll do it differently now. Not with longing, not with ache, but with a quiet kind of gratitude. Because what they forgot made you who you are, and what you remember, what you still whisper, has become your own form of healing, your own kind of poetry, your own quiet proof that you were there, and that you loved deeply, even when no one stayed to echo it back.